we're going to go ahead and get started. I know we've got some folks online that are watching as well, and pleasantly surprised by being joined today by Senator Van Valkenburg, who is a very diligent and ever-present member of our General Assembly. I say that I see him pretty much everywhere that I go. So thank you so much, Senator, for being here. Thank you guys all who are here in person and those that are watching online and those who maybe have sent in some questions as well. I wanted to have this forum on housing for a few reasons. One, this housing issue is particularly important and personal to me. I bought my first house using my GI Bill shortly after getting out of the military, and I was, I think, 19, 20, early 20s. I know it was 25 years ago because I went into labor with my oldest son as we were moving into the house. And I bought that house for $99,950. And at that time, it was just an impossible dream that I thought had come true, that I was buying my first home as I think a 20 or 21-year-old at that time. And several years went by, and my husband and I got into a place where we were able to upgrade, and I had graduated law school, and so we bought a bigger house, and that one was just under, I think it was $249,000, and it was twice the size and on twice as much land. And again, I thought, wow, I am really living the dream. We kept the first house to be able to rent it out. We used his VA loan to be able to buy it because even at that point, we didn't have tens of thousands of dollars to put down. Well, as happens to 50% of folks in our country, that marriage ended in divorce, and we ended up losing both of those homes to foreclosure. And so after that, I became a renter. And for quite some time, I rented because I had to. As you can imagine, my credit was tanked. My income wasn't where I needed it to be. And so I rented for quite some time. And then as I got better and my law practice grew a little bit, I was in a position where I could start to look to buy. But as a single woman, I wasn't interested in doing so. It was just easier as a busy career person and a parent. I didn't want the responsibility or couldn't take the responsibility of maintaining a house. And so I became a renter by choice. And that was, probably 20 some years ago, or 20 years of renting. Now I'm remarried and in a place where I can afford to buy, but I am receiving the sticker shock that so many people are that are either first time or second time buyers or what have you, because the price of entry has changed so dramatically. And it frightens me. It frightens me for me, because I have to buy a home in Three Chopt, and out of all of the Henrico districts, that is going to be the toughest place for folks to buy a home. The cost of dirt is, I think, 3 times more expensive there. It frightens me for my 2 adult children. My daughter is in her 30s. My son is in his mid-20s, and they've never been able, despite having professional jobs, been able to live in a home without having a roommate or a partner helping them to pay their rent, much less try to buy a home. And it frightens me for my youngest, Lennox, who is 10, who God only knows what the housing situation will look like when he's in a position to need to be able to find a home of his own as well. And so as I was sharing with Preston, when I came into office, one of the most eye-opening things was receiving all of this information about the problems that we have to try to solve at a local and at a state level, and realizing how the housing situation got to where it was really exemplified how complex the solution is. But I truly believe that it starts by everybody having a good understanding of how we got here, what our options are, just various questions to help us all be on the same page so we're not buying into a lot of false narratives about the problems as well as the solution. So I really do hope, I know that the folks on this panel have a lot of really good information to share about the subjects that they came to talk to, all related to housing. I hope if you're seated in the audience or if you're online and you think of a question, please do not hesitate to ask. If you think of something after today, please email me and let us know. I'm sure Senator Van Valkenburg would welcome those questions as well. We are really committed to doing what we can locally and at the state level, I'm sure, to solving this crisis as much as we can here in Henrico County. So again, thank you all for being here. We've got some great panelists. We're going to start with a subject that is relatively quick before we jump to some of the more meatier subject matters. But we are going to start with the community rating system, and Ross Weaver, who's going to give us some information about some changing flood insurance information. So come on up, Ross.
much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the folks who are online. So I'm going to be providing a quick overview on flood insurance and the community rating system. I do think this is quite a relevant topic before the larger housing conversation. Good information if you're a prospective home buyer, if you currently own a property, or even if you're a renter. It's definitely something you want to be aware of. Great. So there are really three overarching topics to this discussion. One is how to identify your flood risk. The second is what the county is doing to address flood insurance and how activities and strategies we're undertaking to create a more flood resilient community. And three, just getting into a little bit of flood insurance coverage, things you need to know about, be aware of. So we'll hop right in. So first, knowing your flood risk. So why is this important? Well, Virginia is a buyer beware state, which means that it's the responsibility of a prospective buyer to do the due diligence on the flood risk of the property they're looking at. So when we think about flood risk in Henrico, there's really three kind of larger flood hazards that we're talking about. The first and the largest one is the mapped floodplain, which is what we call the special flood hazard area. So this is essentially the area that has a 1% chance in any given year of flooding in a large storm. So people will sometimes refer to this as a 100-year flood. That's something of a misnomer because these flooding events can occur much more frequently than one in every 100 years. It's just a 1% annual chance that the area in that floodplain will flood in a given year. So FEMA creates the special flood hazard areas, but the county, Henrico County, is also a bit unique in the sense that we've also mapped county floodplains as well. So these are areas that have similar high risk. They are regulated the same way, but it's just sort of an extra step the county has done to be proactive looking at flood risk. We also consider dam break inundation zones. So these are the areas that would be susceptible to flooding should there ever be a dam break. And then you have the drainage or stormwater flooding. So these are ponding, local flooding, infrastructure flooding that might sort of be more of a nuisance flood. Probably not the kind of things that are going to require an insurance claim, but something to certainly be aware of as well. So this image sort of just kind of shows that again, that we think about the special flood hazard area. Obviously, those larger storm events are going to be less frequent, but substantially more damaging. FEMA also maps the 500-year floodplain, which is the floodplain that has the area that has a 0.2% chance of flooding in a given year. So now that we've discussed those terms, how do you actually identify the flood risk for your own property or a property that you might be considering buying? Well, we have a great GIS resource at Henrico County, the Henrico Flood Zone. So this is going to show you the special flood hazard areas we discussed and also the dam break inundation zones. If you go to the Public Works website of Henrico County, you can find it. There's a lot of different links towards it, but really the simplest thing to do would just be to Google Henrico Flood Zone. This will be the first thing that comes up. You can type in your address, the address of any properties you're looking at, and that'll tell you, if you're in one of these special flood hazard areas, if you're in a zone of medium risk, moderate risk, or if you're outside of the floodplain. No, the county is very proactive in dealing with flood issues. We have a range of planning initiatives and projects, but since we're really focused on insurance today, we're really going to focus on the National Flood Insurance Program and then the community rating system. So the National Flood Insurance Program has been around since the 60s, I believe, but Henrico has been participating since early 1981. And so essentially being a participating community in the NFIP means that property owners can purchase flood insurance policies through the NFIP. That's important. The majority of flood insurance policies are backed by the NFIP, so that's quite important. And then there's a sort of a subset of the NFIP that's known as the community rating system. This is actually a very interesting program. It's essentially a voluntary incentive-based program that rewards best practices in floodplain management. So the county enrolls, there's a set of requirements they have to follow, and then it's essentially a point system where different activities will get you different points within the program. So for example, preserving open space in the floodplain gets you a lot of points for the community rating system. Having public meetings where you discuss flood risk and how to get flood insurance, things like that also give you points for the community rating system. So there are 10 classes. You start at 10, you go all the way down to 1. And what's really interesting is that each class corresponds to a 5% reduction in flood insurance premiums. So Henrico County actually joined the CRS just last October 2024, and actually came into the program at a class 5, which is very, very impressive. That's actually tied for the best score in all of the state of Virginia. And that was the first time we've enrolled in this program. So it's a great start. That means that anyone who has a national flood insurance flood policy in this county gets a 25% reduction in their flood insurance premiums. That's applied automatically. So no paperwork you have to do, nothing to worry about there. Just one of those ways that the county is trying to be really proactive in reducing risk and also making it a little bit easier for folks to go ahead and get flood insurance. Now, why is it important to get flood insurance? One, not everyone realizes this, but homeowners insurance, renters insurance typically does not cover flood damages. This is a big deal because even 1 inch of flooding in the house can cause about $25,000 worth of damage. And obviously, no one has that kind of funding available when these disasters come. It's also important to note that with auto insurance, you need comprehensive, or what we call in Virginia, other than collision coverage, to also cover those flood damages. So that's something to be mindful about for your autos as well. And then while we talk a lot about the special flood hazard area, those areas that have the highest risk in the county, also really important that this flooding is not just limited to the special flood hazard area. In fact, I think something like 40% of all of the claims through the NFIP are actually out of the special flood hazard area, the areas that have that lower risk. We're still seeing quite a lot of flooding there. So if you're not in one of those flood zones, I would still deeply encourage you to take a look, get a quote, see how much it might cost. It's quite a useful thing to have, and it's actually one thing to note about that. These policies, when you enroll in them, they have a 30-day waiting period. So say there's a hurricane coming, it's too late to get flood insurance. You need to go ahead and get at least 30 days before it actually goes into effect. So you just want to be really proactive in thinking about that. So now you've decided that you want to check out flood insurance. How do we do that? There's a very easy tool to get a good quote for flood insurance. It's called floodsmart.gov. And by the same token, you can just Google NFIP flood insurance quote. This is the first link. This really it says 10 minutes. It takes less than 10 minutes to get a quote through this tool. Very, very simple. It's not one of those situations where you start getting spammed with there's no one calling you and asking about quotes. This is just a very clean system. So we completed one recently just to take a look at it to see how it worked. Like I say, very simple. You can play with the sliders, so you can change the coverage, you can change the deductibles. So if you're a little concerned about the cost, you can raise the deductible. And once you've gotten that quote, they'll actually give you the opportunity to share that quote, to save that quote. You can bring it to your own insurance agent, but they also will have different agents that are in your area that you can call and share that quote directly. So it's a very simple tool, very good way of just seeing how much it would cost. And like I say, if you're not in that special flood hazard area, it's a lot cheaper to get a policy, and you also could end up using it. So it's a good thing to take a look at, just see what your risk is, and then see what a quote might cover. If you need some more information about your property, or if you're looking at purchasing a home in Henrico, if you need to get more parcel information, this is a great resource as well. This is the county's real estate database. You can Google this just by going to Henrico property search, typing in an address, and they'll give you a whole bunch of information that you can use when you're thinking about this, when you're determining your flood risk, when you're thinking about these quotes. So that's a great resource to have in mind as well. And that's it. I wanted to keep it very brief, but I'll be around after the meeting, so I'm happy to talk about anything to do with flood insurance, but also any of the other initiatives the county's doing for flood resiliency, flood mitigation. If you have any questions and you think of them after this meeting, flood@henrico.gov is probably the first place I would go to. We'll get in touch with you right after that. We'll be sure to set up a meeting, talk through any issues you might have, any concerns, or if you just want to discuss more about what the county's doing, we'd be happy to do that as well. So that's all I have, and thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ross. And I specifically prayed for it to rain like it is so that you guys would feel the need for flood insurance. But all jokes aside, Ross is one of just so many staff members in Henrico County that, in so many minuscule departments or portions of departments that are passionate about things that we don't really think about kind of, in the big scheme of things. And they really work incredibly hard. So when Ross talks about these programs and the ability to get that additional help for residents for Henrico, that didn't just land in their laps. That was something that they sought out intentionally and did a really good job in the process of to get that maximum benefit. And they're uncelebrated all of the time because folks don't realize that how hard they're working about these, kind of niche areas that we don't think about a lot. So thank you, Ross, for preparing that very informative presentation and for everything else that you do. And I hope that folks do take advantage of getting that. Like you said, you don't want to wait until, a storm is knocking on our door. We're going to move now to the housing panel itself. And so I am going to ask the folks here to introduce yourselves so that the observers can know who you are and why you're here. I'll start with you.
Is that better?
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I'm almost Hello? Okay, let's see if it works now. Got it. All right, third time's a charm. I'm Elizabeth Greenfield. I'm with the Home Building Association of Richmond. I represent local area home builders and developers and the variety and trades that support land development and home building. So I'm excited to be here. I don't have a presentation. Preston Lloyd, who will introduce himself shortly, will give the presentation on behalf of the industry, but I will be here to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. And good evening. Good evening, everyone. My name is Sheila Miner. I am the County Director of Finance for Henrico. I am on the panel tonight to talk with you a little bit about and help explain the mystery behind real estate assessments and the assessment process. So.
Thank you, Sheila. Good evening, everyone. Eric Lebo, I'm the Director of Community Revitalization. I'm here to talk about what affordable housing is and isn't. Talk about some of the challenges that many individuals and working families are facing in the market, and also share some updates in terms of the benefits of affordable housing. And I might talk a little bit about some of our initiatives that we have going on at the county to help our workforce afford housing, as well as members of our community better afford to purchase in the community.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Preston Lloyd. I'm a real estate and land use attorney at the law firm of Williams Mullen, and I'm here primarily to talk to the question of why does it seem like it's so hard to create the housing that we need? And so I'll try to connect some of the dots, alluding to a few of the concepts that I think Mr. Lebo is going to speak to as well. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Skylar Van Valkenburg. I'm the state senator for Western Henrico County. And I was just here to come as a citizen myself. But this is a topic I care a lot about. And I'll give you three stats. And I'm going to have to leave early, so I apologize for that. But I'll give you three stats that I think are pretty relevant to this conversation. Of the 10 cities that had the highest rent increase in the last year, Virginia had 3 of them, including Richmond. Austin, Texas built 45,000 new homes 2 years ago. The entire Commonwealth of Virginia built 39,000. Okay, and then in the last 5 years, the median home sales price in the region, Henrico's increased 52, Richmond's increased 52%, Chesterfield's increased 55%, Hanover's increased 55%, Goochland's increased 62%, New Kent's increased 48%. 92 of our 133 localities saw over a 50% increase in the median sales price, including localities that lost population, right? So when we talk about affordable housing, we're really talking about a problem that is pressing now.
And Senator Van Valkenburg is always the life of the party with really cheerful information. So thank you for that, sir. But no, I thank you. And that's a really important point to make, I think, because folks do need to really understand that this is not, we criticize a lot of decisions that are made on a local level or even a state level or what have you, but this is bigger than that. This is not about, any one locality or even any one state or commonwealth. This is a national crisis, and certainly some areas are doing better than others and some localities are doing better than others, but it really, I think, goes beyond just kind of the small questions that sometimes people think about. And so to that point, it's a great segue to Preston's presentation. He's put together some really great slides, which I think is a good way to start off.
In fact, thank you. I think Mr. Lebo is going to lead us off, and
Okay.
then I'm going to jump in. So
All right.
I'll let him set the table.
No, actually come up to.
Clickers, or there's a clicker.
So thank you again. Good evening. Thank you, Mrs. Roundtree. I appreciate the opportunity to share information about housing. Mrs. Roundtree talked about a lot of county employees are very passionate about the work that we do. I've been doing housing work or planning type work for about 26, almost 27 years now. And I get excited, but I get depressed as well when I hear stats like that. So thank you, Senator. I appreciate that. But many people have false ideas of what affordable housing is. So I wanted to just help define that for you all. So affordable housing is simply housing that's affordable when an individual or family spends no more than 30% of their household gross monthly income on their housing costs. So for a renter, that could include their rent plus any utilities that they pay. And then for a homeowner, it would include their mortgage, but also property taxes and insurance that they would pay. So another way to sort of describe it is housing is considered affordable when a household can live in it without sacrificing food, healthcare, and other essentials. And one of the things that we often talk about is you have an affordability problem if you pay more than 30%. I'll qualify that in a second. So for a family making $200,000 a year, they probably could afford to spend more than 30% of their income on housing, but still have enough left over to meet the other essential needs in their life. But a family that makes $85,000 may or may not be able to make ends meet if they pay a whole lot more than that 30% of their income on housing costs. And a family's capacity to meet their expenses also depends on other factors like family size. So the more kids you have, the more expensive other essentials in life are. And then the age of children. We all probably have kids in college or had kids in college. We know that college tuition is not going down. So people's ability to afford housing is impacted by children and children's college tuition. What are the benefits of affordable housing? So many people don't think about this, but housing is probably the single biggest wealth building opportunities that an individual and their family can have. It provides that financial stability for individuals and families. It promotes healthier families and communities. You may ask, how does housing help with making families healthier? Well, when people are not cost burdened from a housing perspective, they're able to spend money on preventative medical care and other things that could then make them a healthier individual or family. Kids do better in school when their parents aren't moving frequently because they're not able to afford their home. Families are able to spend more money on child enrichment activities because of the fact that their parents are not cost burdened from a housing perspective. The other thing that many people don't think about, housing supports economic development. You may ask, how? It supports economic development. A lot of major employers have started to look at whether or not their workforce can afford to live in the community in which they're starting to locate. So it's important that we not only build housing, but we also create opportunities for more affordable housing to be created. Senator Van Valkenburg stole my thunder a little bit, no. But I don't have a lot of data for you, but one of the things that we did learn is that the income needed to afford a home in Virginia rose 76% between 2020 and 2024, 4 years, the income needed. So if you look at the chart here, the median home price in 2020 was $287,000 in 2020. That same median home price in Virginia was $384,576. So the monthly payment, which was $1,573 a month, went up to $2,759. Pretty expensive. We look at the income needed to afford a home right now based on 3% down payment. So the income needed right now is about $123,583, and this is in the Richmond region. So it's more than double that of an elementary school teacher salary. We have an affordability problem, and not just this county, but in this state and this nation. We look at data. This is data from the Central Virginia Multiple Listing Service. So real estate data, realtor data. A healthy market has about 6 months of supply. If you look at the column or the table on the left, if you compare January of 2024 to January of this year, we were at a 1 month supply of housing inventory. We're at 0.9. So we're worse than we were in January of last year. If you look at condos and townhomes, we actually got a little bit better in terms of months of supply. We went from 1.4 months of supply to 1.8. But take note that the median sales price for a single family detached, that went up, as well as the median sales price for condos. It went up when you compare the numbers in January of this year to January of 2024. We also looked at affordability. We looked at 3-person households. We're assuming 2 working individuals and a child. And we looked at us folks in the affordable housing or the housing world always tend to speak in area median income. And those are sort of where a lot of the programs that support individuals that may need some housing support, they tend to use that as the barometer in terms of whether people qualify or not. So if you look at 80% area median income, that's the cutoff for most of the federal housing programs out there. The income amount is about $79,450 for a 3-person household. The estimated home price that they could afford is $241,000, almost $242,000. And the estimated mortgage payment, including taxes and insurance, not just their mortgage payment, but the taxes and insurance, is $1,854. I'm going to go back here to a table. So yeah, they're not able to afford that median house in Virginia that we talked about. We compared different occupations. So some of these childcare workers, retail sales individuals, correctional officers, paralegals, police officers, and dietitians all fall below that 80% threshold. If you go above that to 120%, they're still just slightly below in terms of what they can afford, that median sales price in the county. And again, that $2,780 or the $2,780 a month, that is including taxes and insurance, not pure mortgage payment only. So we talked a lot about the challenges. I talked about affordable housing, what's considered affordable. And keep in mind, these are working individuals and families that cannot afford to purchase in our community. And those individuals that are fortunate enough that can rent, one of the challenges that they're facing is they're not able to save enough because they're paying pretty much most of their income towards their rental costs. They're not able to save for a down payment and closing costs. And I was looking at some numbers with a colleague of mine today, running some sample scenarios. You're between $25,000 and $40,000 in terms of what you have to come to the closing table with some loan product. So it's pretty challenging. But we work a lot, and I'm going to talk about our trust fund program. So I'm going to do an audible here, if you don't mind, Mrs. Roundtree. So we have a program called the Affordable Housing Trust Fund Program. The picture on your left at the bottom there, it's our units that are built to same standard. They're market rate and they're affordable. And when I say affordable, again, affordable to working individuals and families. And you could not tell me which is the affordable unit and which is the market rate unit within that particular development. So it's built to the same standards. It's compatible with the existing community. We don't want people to be able to figure out and point out which home is affordable versus which home is not affordable. And it's built with oftentimes sustainability features. So things that will make utility costs a lot lower. It's built with, Energy Star appliances, things that could, again, help lead to greater levels of affordability for that family or that individual that purchased it. These are other examples of affordable housing that was developed, and I can guarantee you, if you drove down this street, they're probably the nicest looking homes in those particular communities because, again, they're built to the same standard as any other home. Those are interior photos at the bottom. And those are the exterior photos of houses that you would not believe are occupied by individuals and families that need that affordable housing. And again, the teachers, the firefighters, the police officers, any other individual that you would want to live next to, those are the individuals that are occupying these homes. One of the things that Mr. Lloyd will talk about are some of the challenges that are impacting the development of quality affordable housing. Everyone knows that construction costs are increasing, right? During the pandemic, we saw huge shifts in terms of the cost of materials, supply chain shortages. We all heard that during the pandemic. Materials have gone up, inflation, and everyone knows interest rates are up. I think we're at what, 6.25%, 6.5% roughly in terms of interest rates. Yeah, they're higher than they were when the pandemic first hit. I remember running out to refinance because rates had dropped into the 1.9, 2 point something threes. I was ready to refinance because we hadn't seen those days in a while. Probably never had seen rates that low. Lack of sufficient skilled workers. There's not as many people that can do the work. So framing and all the other trades that are needed to build a home. So when there's a lack of employees or folks to employ, then that drives up the cost because there's more demand for that particular skill, but fewer people to do it. And then there are other challenges that could delay the ability for builders and developers to bring homes online that Mr. Lloyd will talk about that may add time and money to the cost of development. Thank you for listening to me, and I'm going to stick around as well to answer any questions that you all may have. Thank you.
Tell who doesn't do karaoke very well.
Nobody wants to hear that. I have to go, but I want to say one thing before Preston gets in. And I think I've become very passionate about this at the state level and have carried a bunch of legislation around housing at the state level. And one reason why I think that's really important, and I wanted to note before I have to leave, is you live in a county that does the right thing. Right? You live in a county that's trying to be solution oriented, that is trying innovative things, that is finding ways to create affordability and to have enough housing supply. But one of the reasons why the price continues to skyrocket in Henrico is a lot of our neighbors do not do that. And so, I was at a housing panel with Mark Warner, who was raving about Henrico's housing programs. And one of the panelists looked at him and said, yeah, but the problem is the cost of dirt keeps going up so much because nobody else is doing it. Which means that ultimately there are some state solutions that we're going to have if we want to actually make it so that I would add to the working people, young families that need a starter home to stay here, to stay in that job, to be able to work their way up. And we don't want to price them out either. And so I just want to throw that into the mix and I want to make sure Henrico County gets the credit it deserves because they really are doing the right thing. But a lot of our localities are not. When 92 out of 133 have a greater than 50% increase, and another 24 have a greater than 40% increase, right? That's a systemic problem that can't be solved playing whack-a-mole. So I'll just throw that out there. But thank you for your time.
One of the things I said I would talk about our programs. I mentioned our trust fund. I would like to shout out our board and our county manager. It's $60 million that was put into supporting individuals and families to help better afford their home in the community. It's over the next 5 years. And again, it's when we looked at it, comparing it to other partners, it's pretty significant. It's a significant investment in the individuals in the community. So again, we have that program. We have other programs that help with down payment and closing costs. We have a ton of programs, as Senator Van Valkenburg talked about. But again, I always think about the manager when he says, just throw away the box. We are trying to figure out how to solve this problem as best we can. Thank you.
Well, that's a perfect segue. And as always, Mr. Lebo is a tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. So we now know that there's obviously a problem, and yet we also recognize that we live in a free market economy. And so if everybody in town is saying, I want a cup of lemonade, why can't I find a cup of lemonade? Geez, I'm so thirsty for lemonade. You would think that somebody would open a lemonade stand. And yet here we don't have housing. And so we all know that we want housing. We want cheaper housing. Why isn't the market fixing this? And I think after my presentation, you'll begin to understand why it takes creative solutions coming from Mr. Lebo's office, coming from the leadership of your board, coming from your state leadership like Senator Van Valkenburg, that's helping to drive solutions in this space. But first, let's talk about the challenge. A lot of this I won't Mr. Lebo covered it better than I would in sort of setting the table for recognizing the need. And yet I'm a visual learner. I like this map here. It's sort of a heat map. If you see red, that means that it's a community where less than or approximately 40% of that households in that community can actually afford the median priced home. You heard the specific numbers for Henrico from Mr. Lebo's presentation, but just looking around, you can kind of see what the spectrum looks like. And so clearly it's not something that's focused in Central Virginia, although I will brag a little bit as a resident of this community that there are a lot of people who want to live here, and that's also exacerbating part of the challenge. So supply and demand. I think we're all familiar with the concept when there's a lot of demand for something and there's not enough supply, then it has an impact on the price of that thing. And that's effectively the essence of the housing shortage crisis that we're dealing with. And it goes back decades. It originally arose in the 1980s when suburban communities turned toward large lot subdivisions as the primary way to facilitate the delivery of housing to a growing population. And without going into the weeds of land use development, we have found that that is not a long-term sustainable solution. You can't have one type of housing. You have to have many kinds of housing. And so we're playing some catch up on that. But in the meantime, if you look at the average incomes versus cost of construction, you'll see that median incomes have risen just over 30%, adjusted for inflation over the last 60 years, whereas the home price, median home price and gross rent have risen over 120 and 80%, respectively. Obviously, that shows a diverging curve, which means that costs are continuing to outpace and far outpace the incomes that residents have in order to be able to afford that housing, leading to the challenges that Mr. Lebo quantified. You can't see these numbers, but let me just give you a little bit of context here regionally. You have four different graphs here, one for Chesterfield, Hanover, Henrico, and Richmond, if you're moving right to left across the page from top to bottom. And if we call out Henrico, what this is looking at is three lines, the green one being median household income, the yellow being median gross rent, so you've got for sale versus rental, and then median sales price. Thank you. Vanna White's assisting with some visual aids here. And as you can see, that curve is diverging. And the time period here starts with the 2008 housing crisis. And so what you see is a big dip in median sales price because the market reset. After the Great Recession in 2008, the prices of homes came down because the bubble had burst. There was overinflation in pricing, and so all of a sudden people could buy at a lower price, and yet the curve immediately goes back up. And there still is that gap between, you can see where the curve crosses, the red crosses the green, where the median sales price has far outpaced median household income. And that gap continues to widen, which just exacerbates the crisis that we're describing. More data on median sales price. I could go into chapter and verse on this, but I think you get the idea. Let's get to the why rather than the what. Although I will pause here just a moment. Looking at a small microcosm of what we're doing here, and we heard an anecdote in the introductory remarks earlier this evening. When you look at starter homes, meaning homes that are in a range of 100,000 to 300,000 as the price, if you look at how many days on the market those houses are staying available before they're under contract, and this is from the Central Virginia Regional Multiple Listing Service, MLS, you'll see that in the middle, that's where it's only going for less than a week, approximately a week is how long they're staying on the market. They're flying off the shelf. And anybody who's been in a bidding war understands that dynamic. It means that people who can afford a certain house are competing with people who can afford a more expensive house. But those more expensive people, the people who can afford a more expensive house, are putting in higher bids. So it pushes the pricing up, which means that everything gets pushed up in terms of the overall pricing. So when you have a lack of inventory, it has an overall effect of increasing the price that housing at all areas of the spectrum are going to go for. And then likewise, this is connected to rental housing. Again, all these concepts are interconnected. It's like a balloon. You push on one side and there's going to be a reaction on a different side of the balloon. When there isn't enough for sale housing, it also means that you have an increase in demand of rental housing because there are people who want to buy, but they can't buy because there isn't housing that they can afford. And so they're forced back into the rental market, which just creates more demand. And guess what? It's the same challenge within the rental market. We're not creating enough rental housing to keep pace with that demand, which means that the cost of rental housing is increasing, which means overall, we just have a community of cost-burdened people, which is what we're trying to avoid. So let's talk about what it takes to create a new home. This is really the essence of what I'm here to talk about. And this slide is busy, but it says it all. And so let me just take some time to walk through this very busy slide. Start at the top left. I'm a housing developer. This is what I'm going to have to go through to get from the point where I identify a site that I can develop for a home to the point where I actually have keys to a home that I can give to a buyer. And spoiler alert, this is about a 10-year process on average. It can vary a little bit, but because of what goes into that, it takes an exceptionally long time and it involves a tremendous amount of risk. And so before I go into each point, the question that I'll pose is, imagine yourself as a developer and imagine you're a new developer and you're being told what's the upside of becoming a developer. You're going to have 10 years. You're going to get to spend a lot of money. If everything goes right, you might get a double-digit return on the money that you've spent, meaning say you get 10 or 12% return after everything goes perfectly well at the end of 10 years. Does that sound like a good deal to you? That's effectively what we're asking a developer to create new housing to accept all of the risk that's involved on this slide in order to get that kind of return. There are some folks out there who are going to say, well, I'm just going to go to a less risky form of investment and maybe my return isn't quite as high. And so again, there's an understanding that what I'm going to walk you through here at every stage entails risk. And so the developer at the end, when they're selling a home, they have to price that home in order to make sure that they overcome all the risk that they're going to navigate throughout this long process. So let's walk through it. First, they're going to find a site that works. There's enough land. It's not wet. It hasn't been designated as wetlands. It's big enough. It has access. And most importantly, it has a willing seller, which isn't always easy to find in this day and age. They're going to negotiate for site control. They're going to negotiate a contract. They're going to find a price. They're going to tie it up, which means they have the ability to move forward. They're going to conduct what we call diligence. They're going to see, can I get clear title to this? Are there any funky easements? Is there an environmental challenge here? Or did somebody used to store something yucky that I don't really feel comfortable building homes on, or that's going to create some sort of environmental liability? Can I entitle it? And this is something that the board members in the room and planning commissioners are, of course, very familiar. That's a very lengthy process. It's going to involve a lot of community input. It's going to involve meeting with neighbors. It's going to involve submitting an application to the county, getting comments back on the application, resubmitting the application, spending money on engineers, spending money on planners, spending really good and valuable money on land use attorneys. That's a very important aspect of that process. And then hopefully they've done it right. They've persuaded the neighbors that it's a great project, that they love the way that it's designed, and it's going to go to the board and it's going to be blessed with an approval. And then they get to hire even more engineers and more architects, and they're going to design the layout of the project. They're going to make sure that the engineering works, that the utilities are there. They're going to finally get to the point where they've talked to their banker. They can get money to acquire the property. It's at an interest rate that they can afford. They're going to close on the acquisition after they've been under contract for quite some time at this point. They're going to start building the roads. They're going to start putting in the utilities. It's all going to be very expensive. And then they're going to lay out the lots. And they're going to sell those lots to a builder. So now we're in the vertical development phase. We just left the horizontal development phase. Their builder is going to go to the county and submit building permit applications. They're then going to get approval to begin construction. The homes are going to be marketed to the public. They're going to hire really good realtors. And then finally, the home buyer is able to purchase a home. And so at every stage, there are third parties who are being paid. There's expensive infrastructure being delivered. And at many points in this, they may get a denial. They may find that the entitlement isn't going to work. They may find that the site plan just doesn't pencil out in the right way. They may not yield enough homes. And so after all that work, maybe they've gotten 60% of the way through this, all of that money is getting flushed down the toilet because they're not going to sell a single home and they're going to have to go on to the next site analysis and selection and start all over, and the process begins again. And so not every project makes it successfully to the end. And so this is why the cost of constructing housing gets high, because beyond what I've just enumerated, the labor costs are increasing, the material costs are increasing. There are things like tariffs that are affecting that. Interest rates are headed in the wrong direction, which makes it more difficult to get the financing for the acquisition of the land, for the development of the infrastructure. And then on the demand side, the same things are making it harder for home buyers to be able to afford these homes, which has a negative impact on the supply, or on the demand rather. And so one of the things that has been interesting as interest rates have gone up is that rather than there are existing homeowners who have equity in their homes, and they might be at a point where they would naturally be changing to a different home. Let's say they've had kids go off to college, they've got a half-acre lot, it's more than they want to maintain, they're ready to downsize. But when they look at what home they could get based on where the interest rates are today, they're going to say, nuts to that, I'm going to stay in my current home, which means that's a home that a new home buyer isn't able to move up and into. And so again, you have people who are trapped in their current home and the market isn't able to turn over, which means that the only homes that are being added to the market are these new homes that I described on this slide. So again, existing supply, new supply, those two things are very much intrinsically connected. And then finally, this isn't really a problem in Henrico as much. Fortunately, this is a county that has a very streamlined process, and that's its Board of Supervisors has long recognized the regulatory cost associated with development. But it's real, and in our region, part of the challenge in creating new housing are what I'll call the regulatory costs of development. And examples of that include architectural proffers. If as part of that rezoning process that I mentioned, the neighborhood that's next door says, we want to make sure that every home in that new neighborhood is bigger than ours so that it's more expensive, because we think that's going to make it more valuable for us when it's time for us to sell our home. And we also want you to use materials that are nice or nicer than our homes. And we'd also like you to put in multiple points of access so that we can be absolutely assured that you're not going to put any traffic into our neighborhood. It's like you've got a Christmas tree and you're just putting expensive ornaments on it until it eventually falls over. It's the infrastructure burdens. It's the density restrictions. We want to make sure they're big lots. They can't be too small, because if those houses are small, it makes me worried that they're going to get sold and those comps are going to make my house look less valuable. And then finally, the environmental restrictions. Of course, protecting the environment is very important, but we have to recognize that with those restrictions and regulations comes an accompanying cost to development. So that's just a very quick snapshot of why it takes such creative programs from counties like Henrico to try to counteract some of those effects that we're seeing in the development world. So with that, I'll hand it on to the next speaker.
Oh, got it. This microphone doesn't like me. If I could tag on to something that Mr. Lloyd said, oftentimes our members from the builder developer side, when they're in the entitlement process, as Preston said, a lot of time comes from getting input from the community. And we hear communities say, well, our neighborhood's growing too fast. We're seeing too much new housing. It's too fast. Well, I think you can see it takes about 10 years to get those new homes from site selection all the way to build. And meanwhile, we're at a pretty significant housing deficit in this region. You know, we have not even a month's supply of housing available, and that is just continuing to impact the supply demand imbalance. And just last year in 2024, in 5 local jurisdictions, Hanover, Henrico, Chesterfield, Powhatan, and New Kent, excuse me, Goochland, not Powhatan, There was only 1,800 new residential lots approved in 2024. We're at a housing deficit. We only put 1,800 new lots back into the supply. That means still another, 7-8 years before we could see those lots built out. Meanwhile, we pulled 4,000 permits out of the region and built 4,000 new homes. We have not caught up from the 2008 recession for how much supply we need on the ground to bring us down to a healthy 6-month supply. And that's scary. I know people don't want to see all this new housing pop up, but we're an incredibly popular region. People want to live here. We're growing. We're growing just by new births, but people are coming here, and we don't have a healthy supply of housing that's going to impact where our next generation is going to buy. We're going to see more multi-generational living. We're going to see more people bunking with mom and dad after college. And it's going to make us not as competitive for economic development opportunities. So I know, it looks like, oh, wow, Henrico just approved a new housing development. That's too much growth. Keep in mind how far behind we are from getting that, healthy pipeline back to that 6-month supply. So just to put a little perspective in some of the numbers that Mr. Lloyd offered.
While Sheila Miner is coming to the podium, I just, want to chime in. I came to this from the perspective of somebody who was very skeptical of the development community and builders, and thinking, oh, well, they're just in it to make a lot of money, and this is all about just enriching rich people to continue to get richer. And I'm still, have healthy skepticism. I think there was a bit of a collective shock and dismay after the 2023 elections with some of us that got elected, and just wondering how this was going to look. And we have, I think, asked a lot of different questions. My colleague, Mr. Rogish, is here from the Tuckahoe district, and I think we're proud of the fact that we have really challenged builders and developers to do things differently. And it may not feel like enough, or it may not feel that way to folks. But what we've learned is that this is incredibly nuanced, and it's not just as simple as, I came in with saying, well, open up your books, developer, and let me see, you're making too much money off of this, and I don't want you to make that much money, and I want you to bring down the cost of housing. And it just is not that simple. And believe me, if it was, several of us on the board would be demanding that to happen. So that's part of why I think that this conversation is important, because it is not as simple as, villainizing developers or builders. It is really about understanding the complexity and figuring out how to approach it from a multifaceted approach. But that's just my little soapbox. So.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Roundtree. A reminder, I'm Sheila Miner. I'm the county's director of finance. Usually the accountant is the life of the party, but and then tonight I think I have an hour. No. I'll try to be brief because I know you have questions, but in the interest of brevity, I'm going to talk a little bit about real estate assessments, which is the effect of some of the causes you've heard about in the housing market. And I can be very brief and say, why do we have assessments at fair market value? And the crux of my presentation is because the law makes us do it. Essentially, the long and short, and we're going to go a little bit into the longer of this, but the Constitution of Virginia and the Virginia State Code both tell us that localities must assess real property at 100% of fair market value. So we have the legal mandate to try and ascertain what the housing market looks like. What is the market for residential property in Henrico? And then try to match that as best we can with real estate assessments. It's a little trickier, a little more art than science sometimes, and we'll kind of explain the magic that happens in behind that process, if you will. So the how we go about doing this, just so you have information when you go through the process of, say, appealing an assessment or reviewing an assessment on your property, is that we divide the county residentially into neighborhoods. Tonight, I'm just going to talk about the residential process. The commercial process is a whole other hour-long presentation for you. For the residential side, we focus on geographies. We are trying to get as much similarity in the properties as we can so that we have comparable assessments across a given neighborhood or a given subdivision. So we are looking at the date of construction for a particular neighborhood, size, physical characteristics, the ranges of sale price, and grouping those into neighborhoods that have similar patterns in those areas. A real estate appraiser in our office may have multiple subdivisions in a particular neighborhood and may have multiple neighborhoods as part of the process, but we really want that staff person to be an expert in the location in which they work. You're going to hear me talk a great deal about sales throughout this conversation, and that's because sales are the crux of what drive real estate assessments. The sales in a particular area tell us what the market for housing is in that area. So we take qualified sales that happen throughout the county. We put them into our computer-aided mass appraisal, or a CAMA system, and they tell us what the market is. They give us an idea of whether the market is increasing or decreasing. They give us an idea of what the sales, where those hot areas are. The previous presentation talked a little bit about starter homes and how little time they're on the market. We take those trends into consideration in trying to determine what the market is for a particular area. What does the market want? The assessments consider, and we're going to get a little bit more into these characteristics, but things like, what is the property like? What is the actual land in a given property? What are its characteristics? What are the characteristics of the home and the buildings on that property? Square footage, condition, depreciation, all of that. And that's put up against the trend for that particular neighborhood and trying to give us a sense of what the market is for that particular area. So part of the science is that we continually measure our own success in hitting fair market value for properties. And we do that through something called the assessment sales ratio. The math is very simple. You don't have to be a CPA to do this. We take the assessments for properties that sell. We divide those assessments by the sales price and get an idea of what that ratio is. If it's 100%, that means that the property sold for the assessed value that we had on it. 90% means that the assessment was actually lower than the sales price. If for some reason it's over 100%, that means that the assessment was higher than the sales price. So you see a calculation here. If it's a $367,000 assessment, that home would sell perhaps for $395,000, we have a 92.9% assessment sales ratio, or ASR, on that property. So taking that to the big picture, and if this neighborhood looks like anything specific in Three Chopt, it's completely arbitrary because we're just trying to give you a hypothetical example here. So in a given neighborhood, maybe these 6 properties sell during 2024. And you can see the assessment that was assigned to them on January 1st of 2024, and then what they may have sold for throughout the calendar year. They may have sold in February, they may have sold in November, and that's going to become important to the process as well. But you can see the market is not an exact science. The market depends on the willing buyer or willing seller. You may have 2 properties that are identical practically in footprint on the same street, but have very different selling prices. And it is just fairly arbitrary as to what those sales prices are. But at the end of the day, our job is to try and get close to that moving target with the assessment so that the assessment reflects fair market value for properties. So you can see in this hypothetical example, some of those sales and how close those assessments were in January to the sales that happen at a later time in the calendar year. So stepping back a little bit and talking about, well, what goes into those assessments that are assigned to the properties that sell and even those that do not. There are a number of factors. At the end of the day, if you look at a property record card online, and I appreciate that was shown earlier in the presentation, our real estate assessment online database, you see that there is land plus the buildings equals the assessment for the property. If it's a vacant land, then there's just a land value, but the building value and the land value are combined for the total assessment. For land, we're looking at things like the lot size, topography. Is it very sloped? Is it very flat? Is there a home site available on it? What is the shape? How does it have egress or what's the location? Ms. Roundtree mentioned about the various prices of dirt in Henrico just because of the demand for those locations. The building factors in a residential property, here are the type of features that will impact the value. And they impact the value in very different ways, and they impact the value in very different ways in very different years. Swimming pools, think of, for example. There are some buyers that are very much interested in swimming pools, some that are not. Outdoor kitchens have become very popular in the recent years, whereas maybe some of the other amenities that we see in buildings have not. How many bathrooms is impactful? What is the square footage, decks, porches? All of these things factor into, and we have trends and we have numbers assigned to the value of these various amenities for a property. So back to our neighborhood. When we go through the assessment process, which is recently completed, you'll see that we'll assess what the trend is for that neighborhood and adjust the properties accordingly. Do we hit 100%? No, rarely. We rarely do. Just because, like I said, that moving target of what the market is for a particular house. The other concept is that we equalize this. We don't set intentionally an assessment to equal the sales value because we use those numbers, those factors for things like bathrooms. And if you're a 3-bathroom house on a street with the same square footage, same condition and all of that, should be roughly equivalent to the same house for assessment purposes down the street that has that same number of bathrooms and that same all of the same characteristics that was what go into the assessment. That means you're going to have variation amongst properties just based on the characteristics that you have in a neighborhood. They may be very similar across the board in price, but they're going to vary based on those factors. So generally speaking, in a hot housing market like what we're experiencing now, those are going to trend up, all of those factors going into the assessment process. In 2009, 2010, 2011, that was a very different story because they were trending downward because of what was going on in the housing market nationally, regionally, and locally. The real issue is not so much the houses that sell, because if we are assessing at fair market value, we have some baseline of fair market value to evaluate how close that is because there's a recent sale. The impact really comes to the houses that do not sell in a neighborhood and the trends that impact because of the sales that happen in yellow, how those impact all the neighbors who are in green. Because again, our mandate is to get as close to fair market value as we can. And so the fair market values for those neighbors will change just as the demand for housing in their neighborhood has changed. So getting back to how we know we are very close, not only is there a legal mandate, there is also evaluation happening at the state level as to how close our assessments are to the market as reflected by sales. Again, that assessment sales ratio comes into play here because on average, we're reviewed, there's an annual report from the Department of Taxation that has every locality and their average ASR for the calendar year. You can see Henrico, we've had a very hot market. We're not hitting that 100%. It's probably not a bad thing that we aren't hitting that 100% because if we hit that 100%, it would mean that there are houses that are being assessed over 100% as many times as they are being assessed under 100%. So generally, what we are hoping to see is something in those 90% ranges in a fairly stable market. We've just not had a stable market to assess in a few years. But you can see the state is monitoring how close we get with those ratios overall. And then they're also measuring the variability in those ratios through the coefficient of dispersion. Again, January 1st is the assessment date. All of our assessments are levied as of January 1st. So the theory is that if you put your house on the market and it's sold on January 1st, it should sell for very close to what that assessment is. The reality is sales happen throughout a calendar year, and while your assessment remains stagnant in an increasing market, you would expect that those prices would go up and that assessment to sales ratio would come down as time progresses. Same reverse happens in a declining market. The assessment sales ratio would go up as the year progresses because the sales prices are going down in a downward market. So January 1st of 25, we took a snapshot, looked at our January sales, and we're at that 96% mark. Now, depending on what the market is going to do through the rest of the calendar year, that assessment sales ratio will change depending on the market's trend, either upwards or downwards as we go through the year. That was a very high level with a lot of information. I'd be happy to answer questions. I'm not sure how you want to handle questions because I think I'm the last. Yes?
So I'm pretty flexible on that. I think we've got a lot of kind of various points or touch points here. And so I'd just like to open it up for any questions. Before I do, though, we do have someone in the audience. Brittany Rose is here from our Henrico Soil and Water Board and had just a very brief program she wanted to make sure everybody knew about, and the brochures are at the back.
Thank you, Misty. My name is Brittany Rose. I am one of your elected directors for the Henricopolis Soil, Water, and Conservation District, and we serve the residents here in Henrico. I did bring along some brochures in the back about the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, and really, as we were hearing about the flooding, right? More often than flooding, you may in your properties or your businesses or your churches or HOAs see issues with stormwater runoff, right? The pooling, the issues. The Virginia Conservation Assistance Program, or VCAP, is a cost share program that's administered through the Soil and Water District. And we can offer cost share funding of up to 80% for those projects. So if you've got problems with water on your property, please be sure to pick up a brochure in the back, or for folks who are at home, go to our website, hswcd.org, for more information. So thank you.
All right, do we have someone that can go around with the mic for questions? Victoria? Oh, okay. I'd like to open up for questions. Yes, sir.
Question is for maybe one of your slides, I think you said something about immigrant labor.
So that was Mr. Lloyd's slide, so I'm going to pass.
No, it wasn't so much immigrant labor as it was, the header was labor. And then, of course, the number of people who can perform labor is an important factor in understanding whether we have enough experienced people who can perform the jobs that subs need in order to construct homes. And then sometimes the immigration policies of a country can also drive whether there's an increasing amount of people who have those skill sets or whether it's decreasing. And so it was in no way meant to say anything about what the country's current immigration policy is, other than just to say what the policy is will have an impact on the overall supply of labor. And so that's one of those things that can impact labor costs overall, as we try to understand, what's happening trend-wise in cost and demand. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. The question was, the slide seemed to refer to immigrant labor. Could you expand more upon that? Is that a fair restatement? Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Deutsch.
Curious what localities that solve job management.
The question is, are there examples of what localities have solved for the challenge? And by the challenge, I assume we mean the regulatory costs of increasing the supply of housing. And if so, what examples there would be? I think every locality is grappling with it to some degree. There are counties that have really embraced the challenge. They've named it. They've said that this is something that we recognize, and they've empowered their staff in order to be creative in trying to provide solutions. And those solutions may be reducing the timeline for obtaining approvals. The longer that a developer is at risk, that they're waiting for approvals, the more that they have to resubmit and go through that process, the more costly it is. And so being able to reduce those timelines certainly has an impact. And I would put Henrico on the list of one of those jurisdictions that's done so. I won't call out any bad actors other than to say that there are some in our region that will, for a simple building permit process, it could take 90 days to be able to go through that process. If you went to Henrico and asked for a building permit, it is going to be dramatically less, assuming that you have all of the appropriate paperwork in place. The other side of it is that there can be risk associated with the asks that a local government and its elected board puts on a developer in order to have their rezoning approved. And I alluded to some of those. I think that you heard from Senator Van Valkenburg that there's a bit of a recognition that there are some jurisdictions that don't really see that as a negative. They don't really see having free reign to be able to ask for whatever they want in exchange for a developer having the privilege to be able to build housing in their jurisdiction. And if Senator Van Valkenburg were here, I think he would be one to say that he's not sure that every locality should have the freedom to do that. And I think, again, I don't want to speak for the county of Henrico, but that's problematic for the good actors, because there will be certain times when a board member, for instance, in negotiating a land use case will need to be able to have a meaningful conversation about how are you going to mitigate the impact of your proposed project on adjacent neighborhoods. And yet, if there are localities out there that are the bad actors, they're going to make it harder for Henrico to be able to have that meaningful conversation. And so, as we know, we live in a Dillon rule state, which is a technical way of saying that if the General Assembly makes a new rule, every locality in Virginia has to follow that rule. That's typically the way local government discretion works in Virginia. And so I would say that Henrico's challenge is helping other localities recognize the nature of this challenge and also to deploy their own solutions for fear that the General Assembly takes away their ability to be creative and to provide solutions, and instead is prescriptive and says, you're going to fix it the way that we say you're going to fix it.
I'll just add, I think your question may have been more what has been done on the regulatory side, but Henrico has been a real leader in addressing and prioritizing housing, particularly affordable housing. As Mr. Lebo mentioned earlier, $60 million trust fund. You have programs for, first-time home buyers that are Henrico employees. We have seen some states implement those programs around the country. But Henrico was the first I've seen locally in this Richmond, Central Virginia region that have done anything that aggressive. And we need more of the localities to follow Henrico's example. But I think Henrico has really set the tone for, we're not going to just let the market solve this. We're going to find a way to solve it as well.
And that's a really good segue, as you're grabbing the mic, Mr. Lebo, for a question that is asked: for affordable housing, how will you stop investors from buying the properties and then renting them to the people whom we want to be able to afford the homes?
Great question. So the trust fund program that Ms. Greenfield just talked about has a D restriction, which will not allow it to be sold to an investor or a flipper. It's a 10-year D restriction that restricts who can purchase it. So the buyer still has to meet a first-time home buyer requirement, the initial buyer, and then each subsequent buyer has to meet that same requirement. So there's a D restriction, and there's a qualification process for each buyer for a 10-year period. The other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of what we've done, I didn't mention that I mentioned the $60 million trust fund, but I did not mention the expedited subdivision review process. So in addition to the funding, we've also provided expedited reviews from a subdivision review perspective, just to speed up that process to lessen or lower the cost to the home buyer. Again, we love developers and builders, but we love home buyers even more. I hope I answered that question.
Yes, I think so. Yes, ma'am.
To represent control for folks who afford to live in them.
Yeah, so I mentioned the Dillon rule, so I'm gonna place the blame on our friends downtown. The General Assembly has not authorized that kind of legislation for most jurisdictions in Virginia. There's an asterisk next to that because in Northern Virginia the rules are a little bit different. But I will say, and your question pertains more to rental housing, the development of apartments, and there's an interesting market dynamic in that. And we often hear, especially from some of the urban legislators who represent districts where the availability of rental housing that's affordable is so constrained. And they say, well, why don't we implement this? The technical term is inclusionary zoning, meaning if you want to get a rezoning, then you, apartment developer, you're going to be required to take a certain number of your units and restrict the rents. And what that does is it means that if an apartment developer was going to develop an apartment complex and they were going to rent the units at rents that the market would support, they're now being told some of that revenue that you would have received, you're not going to get because you must agree to rent it for cheaper, which means that they can't pay their mortgage and they can't pay back their investors, which means they're not going to do the deal. Which means that that's going to stay a parking lot. It's not going to become an apartment complex, which means that we haven't increased the supply of the housing. And so if you take that concept and you kind of draw it across the market, it sounds really good because it means, okay, well, if we're going to get new apartment units, why are we getting them all as luxury apartments? Don't we need some of them to be affordable? But the challenge is that the sticks and the bricks cost the same. The developer still has to pay for it, but the government is telling them they just can't capture as much revenue because they need to lease some of those units to people at a lower income. And so what we found is that that's using a stick rather than a carrot. The carrot approach, and you've heard about the Affordable Housing Trust Fund that Henrico has, that's really the one that moves the needle. Because what it does is it allows the developer to say, if you do X, then you can expect to receive Y. If you build a project in the way that we want you to build it, we'll help you by expediting your permits or by doing other things that are valuable to you. And density bonuses is another great example, as Mr. Lebo says. And so there are a lot of people who are out there pushing for inclusionary zoning. They want localities to be able to mandate some of these restrictions. But speaking purely as somebody who works with developers, if you mandate something that the market doesn't support, then the answer is the market won't build it. And instead, if you say the market's not doing something that we want to build, and so we're going to find a way to incentivize that to happen, then the market will develop it. So it's just a contrast in approach.
Yeah, so your question was, is there something that incentivizes the development of housing for people with disabilities or seniors? Yeah. So So to answer that question, there are preferences or additional points that developers or builders can get if they're located in close proximity to public transit, as well as if they incorporate universal design standards or features in the unit. Can I tell you that we're seeing those developments right now? No. But hopefully with those incentives that are built into the scoring rubric that's used, that will start to see more and more units that are built to those standards. We actually had an interesting conversation with our housing committee about how can we increase stock for seniors, knowing that we talked about this earlier. Seniors don't have a lot of options to move into out of their homes that they're occupying, which is that first-time homebuyer stock. So how can we incentivize the creation of homes that meets the needs of the seniors in our community? I don't have the answer for you, but I think that the points in the trust fund can start to incentivize people to think more about how can we provide opportunities for people with disabilities and seniors in the community. Absolutely. We're still having those conversations about how we can support that need. I need some money and developers that are wanting to do it. And not that we don't have developers that want to do it, but we just haven't seen that particular interest right now. But I'm sure there are developers that would love to build it if the care is there.
Well, I was gonna, yeah, you offered, do you need anybody just to talk about that? We need someone like you at a public hearing because it's oftentimes housing in general, much less affordable housing. It's this fear of the unknown. It's going to bring my property value down, which Ms. Miner addressed. That's not true. It's going to bring crime. There's a number of studies out there that's not true. I'm a firm believer that everyone deserves safe and stable housing, no matter what the price point. But what's affordable to me may not be affordable to you. And that's the message that we need to get across, that affordable housing, we just need housing and safe, stable housing for everyone. So we need more people in our community standing up saying, yes, I support this in my backyard, because oftentimes the NIMBYism and the fear of what someone perceives as affordable housing is going to not allow a case to potentially move forward that's going to provide those units. That'd be great. I mean, there's a lot of, efforts from the housing nonprofits, even from the, the private sector developed to kind of better inform and educate what is affordable housing. And we can tell you it's 30% of your income. But I can tell you as someone who, didn't return to the community that they grew up in because there was no affordable housing. I came to Henrico, but that was about 25 years ago. So we need more housing for everyone, whether it's, low income, maybe you have a disability, or you're a first time home buyer, or, just graduating college, or you're a senior, everything in between. But it's going to take people changing that perception. And even if we give the data, it's really going to take the positive voices.
And I'll chime in that the word affordable is not the only word that people shy away from. It's the density word. I hear all of the time, I know from a logical standpoint in the data that, density is very important to trying to solve the housing crisis as, figuring out where it is appropriate. But you would not believe how much we are inundated by folks saying, please stop approving apartments and townhomes. Please tell me you guys are building more single family homes. And I think it is a lot because of concerns that, folks are concerned that they've paid a lot of money for their house, maintaining it and buying it, and they don't want their perception of what dense housing looks like. And it really is hard to unring the bell of the McMansion era of when we just said, success means you're buying a 4,000 square foot house on a 1 acre lot. And, we don't have the room to keep doing that, but it really is hard to get past that density hump for people to envision what the next steps are. And some of it is repurposing existing buildings for housing that weren't housing before. And we're certainly looking at doing that in Three Chopt because we don't have the land here. But again, we have to have these conversations because I'm telling you, that is what I hear all of the time is, please no more, we need more single family homes. Very true.
I just wanted to add to your question about who's doing that outreach. So spreading the word about kids returning from college that can't afford to rent or can't afford to purchase, or there are a bunch of advocacy groups out there. Partnership for Housing Affordability does a lot of advocacy work. Virginia Housing Alliance, I could name a ton. But yeah, just spreading the word and educating people about who needs housing and housing that is affordable and attainable to working individuals and families. So yeah, just help us get that word out there. And Elizabeth is going to share with you all those meetings that you didn't think you would have to attend.
We had two questions. So start with the lady.
So we go through the reassessment process annually, so once a year. Oh, yes. Now it won't be the same every year because we go through the whole process each year. So the numbers will change from year to year. But yes, you should get an annual assessment notice.
Call the police and have them look into whether the people should be in the home or not. If they don't have permission, then my thought would be, and I'm looking at our police officer in the back, they could have that particular person removed from the property if they don't have the consent of the landowner. And the question was, what do we do if we have squatters in a home in our neighborhood? I would think that if they don't have the consent of the owner, maybe I can talk to you after the meeting if you want. I'll take the information and we'll look into what's going on there. All right.
And we have community policing in Henrico with the design or the goal being that there are officers that are assigned to certain areas. And so hopefully, there's an officer that is familiar with your area that can be a contact person for you, especially if it is a recurring problem like that. So that's another way that it can be approached. But perhaps the officer in the back might be able to help after we finish with the questions. Thank you.
And sometimes just that interaction will force them to move on somewhere else. Even if they can't physically remove them, that interaction with the police officer will force them to find a new location to hang out. So I'm wondering, that's why
So the question was, can you speak to how the county reviews the traffic impact of proposed new housing? And with the increase in density, how can the community be assured that those impacts are being taken into account? Is that a fair? Great. So I can say definitively, absolutely yes. At multiple stages of the development process, the county is reviewing the impact of the proposed development in a number of different ways, traffic being a very important and very significant element of that review. There are traffic engineers who are full-time staff of the county, and it is their job to receive an application for new housing and to look at the existing infrastructure and make recommendations on what they think the impact of the proposal will be on the level of service of the existing infrastructure that exists. And if it's a rezoning, it is highly likely that that recommendation will also include recommendations for what improvements will need to be made in order to make sure that there isn't a reduction in that level of service of a particular transportation intersection or on-ramp or whatever the asset might be, to make sure that that level of service doesn't drop to a level that is not satisfactory in the eyes of the county. And so that's a very technical process. Most developers will have to hire their own engineers and engage in a bit of a dialogue to understand what is the scope of what needs to be reviewed, what are the materials that will need to be provided to the county in order to allow that review to happen. But it illustrates the point that infrastructure is a big piece of understanding density, to your point. And it's something that the county doesn't do in a vacuum. They don't just approve new housing without also considering what the infrastructure impacts will be. And if it's a rezoning, then many, if not all of those costs will ultimately be put on the developer in order to make sure that there is adequate infrastructure to support the proposed development.
So I sit on the Planning Commission this year. This is my first year serving on Planning Commission. And frankly, a lot of projects don't get past a certain point because that piece is not able to be adequately met. Things like how many, an estimate of how many school children will this project cause? Are there enough buses do we have seats in the schools? The egress and ingress of the neighborhood. So it's a major component. But I hear you that it already feels very congested, in particular in Three Chopt. I think, one misconception that is important to address is, we love people moving into Henrico, but we're not out there holding up signs and saying, hey, new people come into Henrico and, forget about the people that have been here for 30, 40 plus years. I think the reality is that a lot of thought goes into improving the quality of life in Henrico through all of the things that we do with, trying to help with affordability, our parks and rec systems, our great schools. And it just, the fact that we're trying to improve the life experience of people who lives here means that people are going to want to move here. And so it is a very attractive place to go. So I heard somebody say, oh, Henrico is just all about trying to attract people to come in from other, Northern Virginia, and that's why everything is so expensive. And it is true that people do come from other areas, but it's not. It's because it's a great place to live. And the only way to stop that is to stop making it a great place to live. And nobody new wants to move in here, but certainly we don't want to do that for the people that have been here. So it really is a conundrum. I think that the transportation or the traffic issue calls upon other things like, can we support remote workers? Can we, lower businesses in that support that? Can we look at other transportation models? We don't all need to have 2 or 3 cars in our garage to get where we're going. Can we have more interconnectivity in our neighborhoods? Do we have sidewalks for accessibility so that we can walk places instead of driving? So it really is a balancing act with, we don't want to, I wrestle. I've got a case tomorrow that I've got to approve, and it's just it's a 9-acre parcel, and I wrestle with it because of that issue and others, but I also wrestle with the fact that it will provide, 26 new homes for somebody to live in. So it's not a perfect solution, but to answer your question as to, is it considered? It is considered a lot. But I validate the fact that it feels like, it's a very scary thing to say, okay, well, we're going to approve a project that is going to have 50 new homes, and that means 50 new cars, and how does that get any better? Part of, just full disclosure, part of my purpose in having this done was so that maybe, you'll leave here and say, I get that the traffic is getting worse, but maybe now that I know how hard it is for police officers and teachers to live, maybe that balances it a little bit, and I won't look so harshly on, a project that otherwise I might have been very frustrated with before. So sorry, I don't have a solution, but it at least is a fleshed out discussion. Any other questions? This discussion will continue. I hope that it's the start of a longer conversation, and I want to respect folks' time. When I tell you that our staff in Henrico will work overtime, and I try to encourage them not to do so, but they are really available all the time to answer questions because they want people to know that their voices are being heard. And we on the board really encourage kind of that free flow of discussion. So if you've got, a perception that you'd like to ask, there's no hard questions. There's no questions that we're going to duck away from answering from. This wasn't a pep rally for Henrico saying we're doing it all right. This was here's a really big problem that we're struggling with. We're trying to do the best that we can. We want to have you guys give us your input, let us know your thoughts and ideas as well, and that will continue to be the way that we approach it. We hope that some of the programs that we're putting in place start to show some real results that you guys can be proud of as Henrico residents as well. But again, we are doing the best that we can for you guys. And so please continue to talk with us and share your thoughts. And on that note, we have Henrico Next project. I don't have a fancy slide, but we are developing our comprehensive plan that will govern how the future of the county goes for the next couple of decades. And we are having information sessions as well as community sessions, I should say, in all of the districts. And so on April 14th here at Deep Run High School from 5 to 7, there will be a land use suggestion session for the Henrico Next project. You don't need to memorize that. Just Google Henrico Next project, go online. There's a ton of information on there about how you can participate in person, how you can ask questions, how you can give feedback online. Please, the percentage of responses that we get back should be much higher. Because we want to hear you guys drive the decisions that we make, and we really need to hear from you all. Okay. So again, thank you all for coming. Thank you for panel. Thank you, Henrico Police. Thank you for PR for helping us do all of this, and we'll talk to you guys later. Thank you.